Particular welcome to several old friends and colleagues I see from all over Europe and also from the Middle East and Africa. So thanks very much for joining us today for this webinar. As usual on these webinars, just a couple of housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded, and as usual with Oxford Cyber Academy, we'll make the recording available later on our website. So you'll be able to catch up on anything that you feel you missed or that you wanted to hear again. As usual again on these webinars, please make good use of the Q&A and the chat. I'll try and keep my eye on any particular questions that seem relevant to what we're talking about as we go along, and then introduce those questions into the discussion. Let's try and keep this as interactive as possible, please. And the plan will be that Siraj and I will talk probably for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll throw the floor open for personal discussion. First of all, to say a few words about myself, I'm Richard Nolton, Director of Security Studies at the Oxford Cyber Academy. I've been involved in corporate security now for about 15, almost 20 years, I'm sorry to say. First of all, in security director roles in financial services and then in telecommunications. But over recent years doing consultancy work, I've also been working with a whole range of companies from aerospace, aviation, oil and gas, and so on. So quite a broad experience of the issues that can arise when cyber crises happen. A few words about this Oxford Cyber Academy webinar series. The whole idea of them is that they're a fireside chat. There's no slides, there's no formality. What I try to do is to bring together colleagues and friends to have really an informal discussion of current issues and challenges in cybersecurity. They're really a central part of Oxford Cyber Academy's mission, which we see as to identify and share experience and best practice through teaching, seminars, research, and consultancy. This webinar today, Dealing with Disaster, is the snappy title we've given it, is the 8th in our current series, and we're going to look at the practical issues we face in managing cyber incidents. I'm delighted to be joined by my friend and colleague, Professor Siraj Shaikh from Coventry University for this conversation. So Siraj, please tell us something about your background and how you came to be interested in this field of cyber crisis management.
Thank you, Richard. And once again, thank you for inviting me for this opportunity as well. I just want to say morning and afternoon to all the participants. I have an academic, predominantly an academic background for almost 22, 23 years now, where I've worked at the interface of security and safety, kind of critical systems, but particularly my focus has been around what we would call cyber defense and more moving on to cyber resilience. So I think one of the key challenges, Richard, around technology and fundamental science is that as the field progresses, there are imperatives on issues around adoption and sharing of that knowledge for towards industry and for wider consumption. And the last 10 years or so, that's been very clear to me, how organizations who are increasingly adopting technology and relying on the digital infrastructure and having more data assets are then able to better react and respond to cyber threats. And that's in light of the increasing complexity of kind of the threat landscape as well. So my job really has been to be not just at the technical end, but sit at that interface where I could address issues like risk perception, address issues around incident kind of management and so on. So in a sense, it's been very organic for me as a background to then follow into what some of the themes that we'll touch on today. So hopefully that helps, and then I can kind of, carry on. One other thing just to mention, I also wear a second hat. I'm co-founder and chief scientist at CyberOwl, which is about 7 years old now as a cybersecurity startup. So we are a maritime security company where we look at IT, OT assets on vessels, maritime vessels, and look at their detection and monitoring. So that's given me some insight, some first-hand kind of insight into not just that adoption of technologies, but also of course, how organizations in that particular sector and related sectors kind of look at incident response. So we can touch on some of those insights hopefully today.
That's great, Siraj. And you touched a chord when you talked about organic development, because when I came into corporate security, as I said before, getting on for 20 years ago, crisis events were almost always about physical happenings: floods, fires, earthquakes, war, civil unrest, and large-scale thefts. Even in one case, I've experienced all of those, but the large-scale theft doesn't sound as if it should be significant, but in fact it blacked out a large swathe of a particular local market in the company where I was working. But obviously digital transformation has brought, as you said, a whole new set of risks that are simply qualitatively and quantitatively different. And first of all, they're not limited by geography apart from anything else. You were unlucky if you had floods in multiple countries. There's also the targeting aspect, a high risk of targeted, repeated attacks by highly sophisticated actors, which have got very severe consequences for bottom line and reputation. And then we're thinking about this, I think, particularly in the context of Ukraine, that risk of deliberate sabotage, particularly in critical national infrastructure, CNI, when there are times of international tension. So I think we've seen over the last 10 years and less, every company is at risk, and every board and executive committee has got to be planning at all levels to manage a cyber incident. I was going to say when it occurs, but it is when, not if, unfortunately. And that really requires a major cultural shift, I think, from the old days when we would talk about floods, fires, and earthquakes. As far as senior management was concerned, risk management was an operational issue. It wasn't a strategic matter. Whereas these days, of course, the implications of a cyber attack can be really serious across the whole business of a company. And forgive me, I wanted to talk just very briefly about a latest British government publication that came out, the Cyber Security Breaches Survey. It's been coming out every year for 6 years now, which means that we've got a little bit of historical perspective from the data. It basically looks at the policies, the processes, and the approaches to cybersecurity for business, charities, and educational institutions. And for those of you on the call, I think it's actually the majority who are not British. I'd be really interested to hear if your governments are publishing similar data and where we could access it. So please, if you've got access to any of that sort of information from your own country, please put some details on the chat, and we'll be very interested to follow up on that. But just to quote a few stats from the latest report, because it was published just 2 days ago in the UK, and it looks at a series of issues around board engagement, for example. It tells us that there continues to be a low level of board understanding of cyber risks and a general tendency to outsource management of these risks to various actors outside the company. It might be insurance companies, specialist service providers, and of course, internal cybersecurity experts as well. But specific stats interested me because I've been following this, as I say, for 6 years, and progress, frankly, is glacial. 82% of businesses, 82%, say that cybersecurity is a high priority for their senior management. Now, on the face of it, that looks quite good because in 2016, when these things started, it was 69%. So there's a 13% increase. 50% of businesses update their senior management on cybersecurity at least quarterly. But only 19% of British businesses have a formal incident management plan. So progress, but I still see a couple of significant buts that I always focus on. I'm always interested to discuss them with people. There are currently more than 2.5 million active companies in the UK. So if you translate the stats that I've just mentioned into hard numbers, it means that well over 500,000 active companies in the UK don't regard cybersecurity as a high priority. And the second but, of course, is how far that high priority is actually being translated into effective action. It's easy enough for a senior manager responding to a questionnaire to say that our management gives a high priority to cybersecurity. But what does that actually mean in practice? And here, Siraj, I'd be interested to hear your comments on the research that you've done.
No, thank you, Richard. Just one thing just to say on those numbers. I think there's definitely increasing awareness amongst the management, and we see that in the roles and the kind of ownership that is being placed in terms of CTOs and CISOs and so on. But it still is only just beginning in terms of the understanding of how we manage with those, manage those incidents, and how are the key kind of dynamics of our responses to it, and how mature we are. So coming back to the project, we a few years ago worked on an initiative led by University College London, also involved Reading University and a few other industry partners, partly funded by the National Cybersecurity Centre here in the UK and Lloyd's Register Foundation, to look at the cyber readiness for boards. And the idea of readiness was, one, to understand the awareness, but also where perhaps boards see the key challenges, where there are key challenges. And for me, the key part there was to reach out to boards, particularly around in sectors that are in transport, energy, and a number of those who would use Internet of Things or cyber physical systems, and so are concerned with security of safety critical systems, as it were. And for me to understand that they've had a lot of experience in safety and management of safety incidents, but are they mature enough in security as well? And so we wanted to really reach out to certain boards and senior management teams, and to engage them in certain scenarios where we could then kind of gauge how they would react to a scenario and how they would rehearse a strategy that they would have. So that has a number of elements, which I will go into some detail. But the key objective for us there, Richard, was really to also test out the methodology that we had put together. So one of the key challenges here is that there is wider understanding, across the piece in terms of, the need for raising awareness for end users and for management, private sectors and public sectors and so on. But what are the tools and methods do we use to do that in some rehearsable, repeatable, kind of effective fashion? And so our research really has that at the very core heart of it. So we've made some progress, and I'll very happy to kind of share some of those insights. And of course, you and I have worked together on some of that. So yeah, that was the key objective for us, to kind of work with the private sector and to understand how we can best address that element of awareness, but also the readiness around cyber risk.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the emphasis in the old days on safety. That's something I came across in the context of operational control systems in the days when, of course, safety was regarded as something that was uncontroversial, and why would anybody ever want to compromise the safety of the company? Unfortunately, we've had to move on from those halcyon days, not least, as I said, in operational control systems. When in the old days, for example, the sort of software that was being used was software put in place, not designed to be touched for years, but just to run quietly in the background all the time. No updates desired and all of that kind of thing, which inevitably in a modern context leads to all sorts of dangerous situations. And the way in which IT and OT have had to start working together has created some challenges, but perhaps that's a side way that we didn't ought to walk down at the particular moment. Tell me a little bit more about the research, and particularly the findings that you evolved from the research.
So thank you. So in terms of the approach, our approach was very much looking at how we craft scenarios that are relevant to the sector, and these scenarios are tabletop artifacts, really, Richard, where they just serve a purpose of drawing people into and getting their focus and attention on a certain development, which is essentially around an incident, an incident that initially may appear very kind of low impact, but ultimately then evolves into, towards a more serious impact, a serious risk to the organization and to wider stakeholders. And so using the scenarios, we incited those discussions, and we engaged the audience in terms of understanding of risk ownership. So what internally roles there are in the organization that are best placed or allocated that element of kind of response around certain risks. So for financial risks, it may be different. For technological risks, for other risks, and so on, it'll be a different element. And then we also used a business risk classification to help kind of the audience characterize those scenarios from a business risk perspective. So this is an important point here, Richard, which I think you alluded to earlier on as well. I think the senior management and boards want to be able to understand at the position that they're placed, the risk to the business. So technology very often is an enabling factor to some business function or a product or a service. And for them to understand where certain types of developments and incidents, I should say, cyber incidents, would pivot into some business risk that they have not foreseen. And because these services and digital infrastructure and data sets are new. So let me give you an example. Data theft, in terms of whether it's customer data, could lead on to significant liabilities. So some of that is obvious from GDPR, but some of it is not obvious as to how that data is then perhaps stolen and then facilitate a whole kind of a sectoral issue. So we've seen this with the airlines, with the aviation sector, where some of the major airlines have been affected and so on. So just raising that kind of attention, and then pointing to a number of different business risk categories. So there were about 6 categories that we looked at, Richard. One was financial, of course. One was around governance. And I think business governance of risk, of all kinds of risk, is a key factor for the shareholders and investors, for them to have confidence that the business is able to manage that. Environmental risks, and we cannot ignore that, increasingly so. That should be on the agenda alongside, what sectors the businesses are, particularly in transport and energy, manufacturing. The environmental risks are high, or the consciousness is high. And then there are more technical risks that are essentially around how a certain incident may pivot into certain other areas of the business which may be undermined. So how essentially the threat actor moves across the organization laterally. So one area of exposure could then lead on to other areas being undermined. And once again, the management needs to understand the level of interconnectivity in the organizations. And I think this is one of the purposes for our scenarios as well. And then there are, of course, legal kind of risks in terms of compliance, and in terms of external kind of regulation and standards and compliance issues that may be separate from governance and maybe separate from financial. So in the safety critical industries, there may not be financial liabilities as such, but it may be just that the license is revoked for an organization to operate, which then would lead on to other risks and so on. And I think the total set of risks coming together for each scenarios as they evolve, it gives a very insightful picture to a business audience, who are then able to rehearse how they would manage an incident as those risks arise. At what point do some of those risks are well understood, and perhaps there are existing mechanisms in place. Perhaps they have encountered those risks before. Perhaps there are sectoral best practices that are there, or sectoral norms that organizations are comfortable with in terms of managing those certain risks, and where some of those risks are completely new. And so in the work that we did with the organizations that we worked with, we realized that there were internal tensions as well as to how perhaps the ownership would sit, depending on how they would categorize a certain risk. Because technology, and as I said and mentioned, is largely an enabling factor for a lot of the businesses. It may come under the category of a straightforward an asset, as a service or a tangible material asset. And if that's compromised somehow, then does that fall under governance? Does that fall under financial kind of internal risks just to manage in terms of asset management and so on? So there are these interesting tensions, and many organizations are now just grappling with it. And our approach, so one reflection on our method, Richard, was that the method helps very much people to discover and explore in a comfortable setting, in a setting where they're not faced with something imminent. This is something that they can plan for. And so they're relaxed in that sense. But equally, what is important is that we were trying to give them the space to explore and be creative and to look for alternatives. So the method allows for that to happen in a comfortable setting, but in a way where we are pushing the boundaries. We are pushing them to look at scenarios where there are a mix of state, non-state actors. So this is something else to consider for a lot of businesses. I mean, in the current climate, unfortunately, what's happening in Ukraine, what we see is that businesses may be targets not because they are involved directly on the one or the other side, but they may be a mere supplier to some other organization, and they may be just be an easy target for exploitation, which may then ultimately result in some disruption. So that complexity, the level of kind of technical adoption now, so we see increasingly the integration of safety and security kind of systems. We see autonomy in various forms. And so we see a number of these elements that I think make it quite difficult for us to assess those risks. And that's why that exploration is very important for organizations. And so far, I would like to think that we are very successful in highlighting those to the particular clients that we worked with, but there is more to be done there. So one of the things that we need to do more of, and perhaps I can come back to towards the end, is how do we make this method useful, internally useful for organizations to become a kind of a ritual where every time there's a strategic shift of some kind and they are formulating their strategy, they have some mechanism to rehearse their strategy and to establish a benchmark where they say, if we are able to be comfortable against this set of scenarios, then we feel comfortable that, if and when, I should say, an incident happens, we can then rehearse. And equally, we could push on the scenarios based on the sectoral or the market demands where the organization may evolve as well. So yeah, there are a number of factors there that we could play with. But in a summary, in a nutshell, that's the key insight and the key approach for us.
Yeah, thank you, Siraj. Very, very interesting. And as you said earlier, I had the chance to work with you on one of these exercises with a major multinational in Europe about a year ago. And it was fascinating to see how it played out. I think a number of things occurred to me. The first one was the way in which you spend quite a lot of preparatory time with the company concerned, really to understand their context, their preoccupations, and then a little bit of how they were structured in terms of how they might approach management of a major cyber event. And the second observation for that brings me right back to my corporate security experience, which is that inevitably in any company, and particularly a big one, there's a lot of politics around ownership of risks and who's going to do what. And these are issues which are quite sensitive in companies. So being able to discuss them, as you said, in an unthreatening environment where a number of successive scenarios are being introduced, means that perhaps in conversations after the exercise and after we've left, can actually be resolved to create a better context for managing the crisis in the first place. Because one of the difficulties, and I always remember this, is conducting crisis management exercises is one thing. Everybody says they're a good thing, we should do them. But when it actually comes to them, my experience was that as you got closer to the day of the exercise, senior people or their PAs would start phoning up saying they were terribly sorry, but on that day they were not going to be available and nominating somebody else. And here you really need the voice from the top, from the CEO, for example, and I was lucky in that respect. The CEO says to his senior executives, no, this is not voluntary, this is compulsory. It's very important for the company. But unfortunately, again, many companies are not at that degree of sophistication.
So absolutely, but I think the culture is changing, and somewhat in certain sectors by force, but somewhat by a clear, genuine need that people see and they're responding to it. So one thing just to add to it as well, Richard, what we did was that the approach is rigorous enough where we engage the audience, and this is a small group of people, of course. It's the senior elite of the management, but still very valuable in terms of their input, of course. So we engage them on a certain set of questions that we take them through, just for very kind of Likert scale type input as their responses to the scenarios, and then we use that data to then put together a brief from the entire exercise to then follow up and just highlight various best practices and various norms and standards and key issues, based on what we found. And that briefing is just meant to serve, perhaps as a reflection on the internal kind of strategy and what areas perhaps there could be improved, what areas perhaps they are keeping up with best practices, and what areas perhaps may need a follow-on kind of intervention and so on. So for example, just to give you one example, I think we do prepare, as you said earlier, very well, depending on the sector. Certain sectors are more regulated, more mature. Certain other sectors are simply just catching up. If you take the financial services, that's a very different ball game to the maritime industry, where things are still just being formed and put in place. So we're very conscious of of people's understanding of risk ownership, and as to whether they are aware of the regulators and what their requirements are, whether they're aware of where if there are state actors involved or even organized non-state actors potentially as threat actors, then maybe they need to work with authorities and the local cybersecurity agency to then follow up. So we are able to help with that in a sense. So I think the exercise towards the end becomes slightly more prescriptive, but the actual interaction itself is left open with only a guided discussion really around certain themes. And this is very important. I think this journey, this learning curve for a lot of the management needs to be self-led. And all we're doing is a facilitation, but exactly in a comfortable closed setting where at least they're able to be creative, they're able to challenge certain norms and standards. And of course, ultimately, to kind of derive the value, from the method that we've kind of put together. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to working on more case studies for this as well. But equally, very happy to welcome any thoughts as well as to what some of the key elements perhaps we need to explore to work with different organizations.
Absolutely, and please do contribute to the chat if you've got thoughts on anything we've been saying. I wanted to ask you a little bit, Siraj, to go into the scenarios and the scenario building. My experience has been that very often an exercise might contain over a day, let's say 2 or 3 or 4 evolutions of a scenario, so the thing develops as it goes along. And I've had experience in the past of senior executives saying, well, that's all very well, but this would never happen in real life. And my story there, my anecdote there is one chap who was a CFO in a large company who bitterly resented having to do these exercises and poo-pooed them all the time. A couple of years later, he became CEO of a major company in Europe. And he actually dropped me a line to thank me because he said, I always thought it was a complete waste of time. But when I was confronted with what actually for him was a very serious crisis, all the lessons I'd learned, not so much about the scenario itself, because of course they vary, but just the general principles of the planning, knowing who to speak to, and particularly who to speak to in government. These are really key elements to learn. But Siraj, talk a little bit about how you built the scenarios. And again, I suspect they're tailored.
That's right. So the fundamental kind of, underlying philosophy here, Richard, is that scenarios need to push the boundaries to fictional yet plausible. And every sector is different. So we research the sector, we research on the organization's key footprints, and we research comparable incidents that are targeting comparable organizations. And there's a lot of threat intelligence now in terms of the threats, but also the incidents as well that have happened, and kind of post-incident reports and forensic reports and so on. So there's a lot of material now that is built up through open source sources. So we then are very careful with our choice of words because we don't want value-laden words to be used in the scenarios. We, once again, as I said, the scenarios are largely descriptive with somewhat a hint around certain emphases that we want to kind of point out to the colleagues taking part. And then also the way the scenarios evolve, Richard, they evolve with some understanding, some early research and understanding of how the digital architecture, the service architecture of those organizations kind of works. And we make reference to technical details of the attack vectors, but once again, to the point where we don't get lost in the technical detail, because that is not of key interest there. That may become a potential insightful kind of, a topic of discussion, and it may be very relevant. So one example, for example, is the ransomware and the tactics around ransomware and how organizations respond to ransomware. So that's one very good example where we tend to now these days dive into the technical details and how perhaps we are better positioned against them. And then we then develop those scenarios so the whole story evolves in a way where we push the organization to consider how they would manage the risk ownership and the changing nature of risk ownership, perhaps, as the scenarios evolve, the changing nature of risks. And so we're very careful to play into the risk categories that I kind of mentioned. And then, of course, also to kind of probe them around media and PR and their approach to communication around those incidents, approach to external stakeholders that they may react to, approach to external suppliers in the IT and security industry who may they rely on for certain forensic investigation or for other kind of management, post-incident management and recovery. And so a number of these things, I think, come together. Now, that, as you can imagine, takes a lot of work, but then is very valuable and insightful, hopefully, to the target audience. So that's our broad approach, if that helps.
Thanks, right. Sorry, while you were speaking there, I was just checking out. There are a number of comments on the chat, and let me just feed them in at this point. Ludovic, hi Ludovic, very nice to be in touch with you again. It's been a while. But Ludovic has made some comments on the chat, useful comments about publications on the situation in France. Maybe some problems with availability in English, but he's also put up a number of links which look really useful. So Ludovic, thank you for that. Rehman Zafar has asked a couple of questions, which actually may be relevant at this point, Siraj. The first one is,
right.
Can these exercises identify policy changes for corporations? What are the outputs and takeaways from these exercises for management? So perhaps you'd like to address those.
Yes, please. So the policy changes, so whether they're policy or strategy, absolutely. And I think one of the key purposes here is for management is to enable the management to reflect on what would work and rehearse that thinking and strategy using the scenarios, and perhaps then draw some reflection on how that may need revision, how perhaps there may be a better way of doing it, or perhaps there are clear gaps in certain technical areas or certain aspects of the organization, maybe financial risks or environmental risks that they haven't considered. So we definitely hope that there is a very strong reflection on those policy and strategy changes. Absolutely. And I think that that's why they also need to be, as I say, a regular kind of a ritual for organizations to adopt, even internally, because the scenarios could evolve and shift every time, potentially. So then they are encountering a number of different kind of, flavors of it, and pushing the strategy piece in a different set of ways. In terms of outputs and takeaways, so we do a briefing document. The actual value of the discussion on the day and the reflection on the scenarios, and particularly the risk categories and the risk ownership areas that we push them on, that I think is very important, because that's one of the key takeaways, because the value that they get as a team to come together and focus their attention, that's either going to signal that they have a very well rehearsed strategy in place, that they're all bought into it, that they all know what the roles are, and importantly, they all can think of and commit to a set of financial and material resources which will be needed at the point, when an incident is finally discovered and established. And the post-event briefing then just helps them to do more medium to longer term kind of planning and reflection. And so I think that would be tailored. And this is also where we bring in some value, because we would then research on certain areas which may have come up. So one of the things you may recall, Richard, is that in our interactions with the organization that we worked with, there were questions that perhaps came about, nothing directly relevant to the scenario, but perhaps they came about because someone had been thinking about certain types of threats, or they had encountered something. And so that's very refreshing, because people are thinking, and they're thinking just beyond the scenarios even. So that just shows the value immediately of just getting people together and just opening up that kind of room for a comfortable conversation. So yeah, so there is that aftermath as well, the after event briefing as well, that we value. One other question, I think, Richard, that Ludovic mentioned. So in terms of other exercises, I just briefly just highlight this. So the idea of doing incident response planning through exercises and looking at cybersecurity drills and so on is now somewhat mature, to a point where there are a number of different offerings in the market. Ours is unique in a couple of ways. One is we are targeting the senior management, the boards in the corporate kind of world, because our research led on to this notion of kind of under preparation, and under kind of capacity in that particular market. And we have developed the scenarios and the business risk classifications and everything else pretty much with that audience in mind. So this is not a reworked version of some other drill that we'll just pull into for this audience. I think this is very important to understand that, because a lot of other drills and capture the flag exercises and so on are very technical in nature, with a very different purpose in mind, I would say. Still incident response, but at a different level. Two, and this is very important, the approach in itself leads up to a good capacity assessment framework. Depending on the organization's needs, especially if they want to commit to it in a more regular fashion, then I think this provides for a very good way of them to internally benchmark their capacity, and then to maybe open it up to more mid-tier management in the organization, depending on the size of the organization. So I think that's a big strength that we offer, that I think, perhaps, there is more room to develop as well. As we work more and more, we definitely aim to do that, kind of evolve the approach as well, and so on.
I'm just going to make a couple of comments as you were speaking, Siraj. The first one is that very often these cybersecurity exercises, and I've been the victim of some of them in companies where I've worked, produced perhaps by the Big Four, among others. You rather get the feeling you're being put through a series of hoops, and that you get a medal at the end for having survived it, rather than it being something more cerebral, where you're actually thinking through and talking with colleagues, as you said, emphasized before, very importantly, in that private way. The chance to say, hey, actually, there's a better way that we could be doing this internally. So I think that the other thing, just about levels of these exercises, my experience, although I'm willing to be corrected, is that usually at the technical level, the performance is pretty good. The technicians doing the disaster recovery, for example, are usually good at their jobs, and they do it well.
Yeah, that's true.
The exception to that perhaps is in cases, and I lived this through the Arab Spring experience, where if you're working for a large company which is grown fast through acquisition, for example, the technicians who are sitting in group, or even the technicians in the local market, if they're a new acquisition, may not be fully aware of all the connections that there are between different systems within the group. And certainly in the Arab Spring context with Egypt, I'm thinking specifically, that caused real problems at the technical level. At the senior level, however, all sorts of lessons were learned, as you say.
Yeah, I think the increasing hyperconnectivity, I think, is a big challenge. Absolutely.
So I'm just more comments are coming in. Ludovic, thank you. You've organized, you've put up a link for the organization of conferences. Kurosh has commented, in the age of the internet and with the disappearance of physical borders, our approach to security must change and evolve towards a ubiquitous defense approach that's both holistic and targeted. Couldn't agree more with that. Holistic's one of my magic words at the Oxford Cyber Academy. Very strongly agree with that. Any comment from you, Siraj?
I think I would just say that I was just reflecting on the potential of state or even non-state actors in being involved. And I think increasingly for organizations, one of the biggest challenges here is attribution, given the asymmetric nature of cyber attacks, and of course, given the sensitivity around it. No organization would just want to jump up and say, the state A or state B seems to have, initiated this. So I think that becomes a big kind of a challenge when you have the media, kind of building up on the hype as well sometimes, and so on. And this to this point about the borders are breaking down, and so we need to consider that holistically. And two, of course, is in terms of any legal and kind of more regulatory kind of follow-up to, depending on the nature of the incident, it is a challenge, because very often if there's a very well-defined regulation that regulates that reporting and so on, that's fine. But when it comes to more deeper incident management or any forensics or so on, then at a certain stage, I think the legal jurisdiction as to where perhaps this sits, and also then any diplomatic and international kind of implications on the organization's kind of presence, especially for large-scale organizations where they may have presence, I think may be a particular challenge. We see this now with the current Ukrainian situation, where unfortunately, there are certain organizations that are operating in the region, but are now having to manage, their kind of rollback very carefully, because this absolutely sprung up on them with no, preparation, and also the way now the kind of response to this in terms of some of the sanctions and so on would mean that organizations would have to manage that very carefully, or even any follow-up to this, potentially any reaction that you may get from hacktivists or non-state actors that may be in a certain region that may initiate any compliance with the sanctions. So yeah, I think that is definitely a challenge which we need to think holistically, for sure.
Yeah, well, certainly since Ukraine kicked off, or perhaps even slightly before, there's been a lot of discussion in the professional literature about the extent to which security people actually should have had a bigger voice in warning about overdependence in supply chain on certain countries, Russia and China being the obvious one. Of course, everybody at the moment is being wise after the event. That's always very easy. But interesting discussions going on, particularly in America, of course, as you would expect, but about the need for boards to be thinking about their dependence, for example, on China. Whether if you're a Western company, you want to be too far down that route in case all of this happens again in a different form. So yeah, some interesting discussions still going on about all of that.
Indeed, I think the supply chain kind of challenges that we are looking at, both due to COVID and the whole kind of restarting of the manufacturing lines, assembly lines, and supply chains, but also in certain areas like the semiconductor industry is facing huge shortages. So how do we then manage that? I mean, certainly for semiconductors, Richard, it's not a straightforward exercise just to set up another fabrication facilities. That it needs significant amounts of investment, significant amounts of commitment, and kind of knowledge underpinning. And so, yes, these are some very serious questions which we'll have to kind of grapple, and organizations of all shapes and sizes are in the middle of it.
Yes, indeed. Siraj, I'm just going to comment. There's one question on the Q&A, again from Kurosh, if I can just read it. Our approach of anticipation and organization being more and more standardized, this makes us predictable and circumventable by predators who are more and more professional. As a result, our perimetric analysis and defense approach becomes obsolete and ineffective. Which risk management approach to adapt, given that currently attack methodology are more and more multiple, complex, multidisciplinary, indirect, multidimensional, and via multiple vectors? Well, there's a simple question to answer in 30 seconds. We could have a whole webinar on that.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to say, so going back to the scenarios, I said that we are trying to push boundaries, and they are fictional settings, but yet plausible settings. I think that is an advantage there. We need to start pushing our kind of creative powers to consider attack vectors that may be realized, which may have escaped traditional risk assessment. And how we do that, I think, once again, the best way to do this is to, one, get the top-down leadership in a room, or come together whether in a virtual room or a physical room, get them to focus on certain aspects, and then to commit to seriously thinking about how we would react to them. So one of the questions here, in response to that, and I think, Richard, I'm sure you would have seen this as well, a lot of the awareness campaigns and awareness material is very good, and sometimes prescriptive as well, as to what the remedies are. But it doesn't really solve the problem, because every organization is different. The level of resource commitment is variable. The security still has a weaker business case comparatively to many other, technical and service improvement areas. So we can have a situation where the management may be very well placed, the business may be very well structured to be resilient to any incidents, but the resource commitment, I think, has to come. And one of my hidden agendas, as it were, as as a mission for me, is to enable organizations to commit more resource, is to take this more seriously, not just from a operational governance point of view, but from a financial point of view. And so we can't escape that, particularly now when the economic pressures are high. But unfortunately, the uncertainty, the political uncertainty, is also high. And these are the kind of timelines or phases in history where most disruption happened, unfortunately, and the kind of potential kind of victims and targets of these attacks, would become clear. So yeah, I think that's my mission in a sense, to help security raise its business case as well.
Absolutely, amen to that. And you took me back immediately to my experiences, old but also very recent. And the fact is that confronted with a case for cyber investment, a board is generally speaking going to be thinking of spending money on things, on technology. And of course, that's important. Of course, you've got to have the right kit, the most up-to-date kit possible. But behind that, there is all of that, as it were, soft area to do with security awareness. If you think of the vast majority of cyber incidents actually having at some point a human component, because some person has done the wrong thing unwittingly, occasionally deliberately, but generally unwittingly through lack of training or awareness. Money needs to be spent in that area too. And in earlier episodes of this webinar series, we've had actually some quite interesting conversations, even with Professor Phil Morgan at Cardiff University, on behavioral psychology and how it can be applied to helping people to do the right thing. I remember as a security director, we're now going back 6 or 7 years, we were very primitive. There were certain lessons that were taught on machines that people had to do once a year to tick the box on their HR record. And actually it made no difference to their awareness whatsoever. We need to get more sophisticated. We are getting more sophisticated, but money needs to be invested in that area too. So yes, very much agree with you.
Yeah, I think there are some more questions and comments. Very happy to for you to, Richard.
So Ludovic is, sorry, I don't want to miss anybody out. We did that one. Ludovic, technologies are becoming more and more complex, and one of the major problems is implementation, which can lead to altering the overall level of cybersecurity and increase the potential attack surface. Do you think that asking solution providers to strengthen the security of their developments is one of the possible solutions, as the White House did in the US a few months ago with the letter from President Biden?
So if I may read this question in a slightly different way, and hopefully still address it, is how much exposed are we due to the weaker supply chains that we rely on? Increasingly, if you take certain industries, take automotive as an example, Richard. An automotive system, the ultimate on-road final product, is as exposed as its supply chain. So it's a classic example of an engineered product that's relying on 100, 200 suppliers from all over the world, and that supply chain is very competitive. It's a very competitive industry. So they're focused on reducing cost. And so that reduction in cost means potential for cutting corners or potential for reusing objects and components and subsystems in some, unprofessional ways or whatever. And so we need to really seriously consider as to how, as a sector, for any organization, how as a sector, they are enabled, given their supplier ecosystem, to then deliver on the best of security, whether in terms of its products and services. So one of the scenarios, one of the elements of the scenarios, and you may recall this, Richard, had a very clear stakeholder kind of a link to the supplier of a certain technology to the organization. And there are interesting tensions, in those relationships, because naturally there's a tendency to shift that liability and that burden on one another. So the supplier may argue, well, what we provide you is very well specified and designed, but it's how you assemble it and integrate it in your final product. Equally, the final manufacturer, the OEM, the integrator may come back to the supplier and say, look, well, this doesn't fit our needs, or this perhaps ignores a certain threat or a risk profile. So that's why it's a very complex issue. And I think I completely agree with the comment here that yes, the serious organizations, particularly those building complex products and relying on kind of a complex supply chain, have to engage with their supplier base. But also, one of the purposes, going back to the exercise that we did, if you recall, Richard, was to then help the organizations prepare for a world where they only have limited influence on the supply chain. So they will have to think of strategies as to how they manage that, and if you talk to the insurers, they would tell you that increasingly organizations are talking to them about corporate product liability. And that corporate product liability is exactly what a lot of organizations should be worried about. If they are delivering on products that are relying on supply chains that they have limited influence on. So this is the kind of world we are now faced with. And I think, if anything, this tells us that we need to be better prepared. And my mission really is to help with that risk perception. And as a result of that risk perception, effective risk perception, organizations should see clear risks, arising out of potential incidents, and as a result, then strengthen the business case for security, and reinforce, whether it's policies, whether it's strategies, whether it's the soft side of the culture, and of course the more tangible things as well.
I very much agree with that. Now, we've almost reached the hour. In fact, we have 1 minute left, but I wanted to leave that 1 minute for a question from Rehman. Could these exercises that we've been talking about be conducted for multiple companies at the same time, or are they just tailored to a specific single organization at a time?
That's a very good question. That's very relevant to what I just said, because if an organization is very well plugged into their suppliers, then it may be that this is done at a sectoral level. And if this is done at a sectoral level, then I think for this to be more effective and valuable to everyone involved, perhaps the multiple organizations that are involved in the exercise could agree on some non-disclosure element or some Chatham House rules where everything said is then staying within that room, to make sure that everyone's kind of covered in that sense. So it depends on existing relationships that are there between organizations and their suppliers. It depends on different sectoral practices and kind of norms. There are incident sharing communities now set up in certain areas, but they are only about incident sharing. They're not about kind of incident reflection and more deeper strategy kind of forming and so on, which is what we enable. So absolutely, I think the answer is yes. We just depends on how we configure that audience.
Right. So at this point, I really must wrap up because we're exactly on the hour. So Siraj, very many thanks for a really interesting session, and always a pleasure to talk with you, of course. To any of you in the audience who would be interested in hearing more about the work that Siraj is doing and the development of these exercises and so on, please drop us a line. You should find our email contact details at the beginning of the chat. And we'd be very interested to talk to you because, as you would have learned from Siraj's comments, this is an area where we're learning all the time and really, really keen to get better experience in dealing with a range of different companies. So please do contact us. And with that, very many thanks for attending, and we'll see you next time. Look on LinkedIn for the next Oxford Cyber Academy webinar. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Thank you.